All right, so hello. Hopefully everything is going well for you guys. I didn't see any of you guys when I held my office hours, so hopefully that means things are just ticking along perfectly and you're all doing fine. So today we're going to be talking about food insecurity in the MENA region, and we're going to focus on some of the lecture. I'll give you a short lecture on sort of the state of things, and then at the end we'll have a question for you guys to answer on the discussion board. So we've talked a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, and as you guys know, the SG goal number 2 is to end hunger worldwide. And as part of that goal, it's to achieve food security for all and have improved nutrition, and also doing that in a way that is sustainable. So promoting sustainable agriculture is kind of tied into goal 2. As we stand today, still there are millions of people who are suffering from food insecurity. The latest statistics from 2017 is that 1 in 9 people in the world are undernourished, and about 1/5 of the population in Africa has the highest prevalence of food insecurity and undernourishment. So this is an issue that is still increasing. There was a time when food insecurity and undernourishment was decreasing, and now the trend overall is showing that there's a slight uptick in food insecurity around the world, and particularly in the MENA region. So, what is food insecurity? I think it's important to understand that there are definitions related to food security and food insecurity, and it depends on the publication that you're reading and how those authors have defined it. Over the decades, there have been multiple different definitions of what food security and insecurity really are, but these are some of the most up-to-date, and these are from the FAO definitions. So food security, this is a condition that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Household food security is the application of this concept to the family level, with individuals within households as the focus of concern. And then on the flip side of this, the idea of food insecurity exists when people do not have adequate physical, social, or economic access to food as defined above. So it's the absence, right? Food insecurity is not just the absence of physical food, but it's the absence of nutritious quality of food as well. So we'll be talking a little bit about how that impacts people's livelihoods as well. So if we take a look at the scale of food insecurity, and I'm just trying to move this out of the way. As of 2019, the estimated number of people worldwide who were suffering from food insecurity was about 820 million people worldwide who were suffering from food insecurity. So that is the lack of the sufficient quantity and quality of food. So within food insecurity, you also have people who are suffering from severe food insecurity, which can have real consequences when it relates to their social well-being, to their mental health, to their physical well-being as well. Obviously, we've all seen those horrifying images of children starving. That would be severe food insecurity. People experiencing, food insecurity that runs for a lot longer than just a couple of days without eating. So, people can have extended periods of time when they're not having adequate access to food. Whereas another part of the population will have a moderate food insecurity. So this is people who are experiencing, food insecurity not on a regular basis, perhaps, maybe facing some uncertainties about the ability to obtain their food. And so they'll have to make some decisions about the type of food that they can access. So sometimes people are faced with the decision of, do I take quantity or quality, right? And a lot of times if you're in a food insecure situation, not surprisingly, you're going to go for quantity over quality if you're forced into those situations. Oops. Okay. So there are some patterns that have emerged within the MENA region, and in your reading for this week, you'll start to see clusters of countries within the MENA region that are facing food insecurity for different reasons as well, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, of course, not all countries in the MENA region are facing food insecurity. In fact, there are some countries that are doing very well, and their population is able to feed themselves just fine. And in some cases, we have populations within the MENA region that are the opposite. They are actually overnourished, and obesity is becoming a problem. But still, the latest estimates of people facing food insecurity within the population in the classification of the MENA region according to FAO is Western Asia and Northern Africa. And that would be 10% of the population within the MENA region, according to the latest statistics, on average in the MENA region are facing food insecurity. There are different types of insecurity. So obviously you have chronic and you have transitory. So chronic would be referring to people who have long-term inability to meet their food requirements, their minimum food requirements. So this obviously has a much larger toll on their bodies. It has a much larger toll on their society and their community groups as a whole. Chronic food insecurity can lead to myriad other things within the social structure of communities. So it can be a really devastating situation. Transitory food insecurity is referring to short term. So the short term meaning 1 or 2 weeks where you're not sure where you're going to be getting your food from to meet your minimum food requirements. There are many different causes for food insecurity, which we'll be talking a little bit about. Oopsie. So conflict, obviously, one of the major reasons for food insecurity in Yemen, for example, is largely because of conflict. At times of war, it's very difficult to have your staples of the food system being brought in to the country. So, and sometimes during war, people are deliberately starved. So conflict obviously is one of the leading drivers in the MENA region as to why food insecurity occurs, along with political stability. So the more unstable the country is, the more likely your population will be faced with food insecurity. The price of food obviously also impacts food insecurity. So people who are already a very low income in the MENA region will be faced with decisions to be made about where they spend their money. And the higher the price of food, then the less they'll get for their money. So that drives food insecurity. Economic recessions, volatile derivative markets, those also have implications for the food system and how commodity crops are traded worldwide. That has a big impact on food insecurity in some of the poorer countries. Natural disasters, of course, when you have severe flooding from hurricanes or tornado damage, or in this region, it would be typhoons. All of those things will play into how the agricultural crops are the productivity of agriculture, which will have an impact on the local food security. And extreme weather events like drought and flooding will also have a huge impact on food security, obviously. Seasonality can also play a role. So if people who are transitory food insecure, this might have more of an impact on them because of the seasonality of when and where you can grow certain crops. And also shocks in the food system. So obviously we'll find ripple effects all around the world from a price shock of rice or wheat or whatever else is at the time going through a food shock. It has ripple effects all the way through the food system. So an example would be the rise in food prices in 2005. Those global prices of wheat skyrocketed, and so did rice and other cereals. They really started to increase in 2005 and getting the highest in around 2007 and into 2008. Which was where the price of those cereal crops really reached their maximum. And due to the rise in food prices, it triggered an event worldwide of panic and unrest as grains became more expensive and the price increased. And as you can see from this infographic, the prices of wheat increased 130%. For soybeans, it was 87%, rice went up 74%, and corn went up 31%. And so obviously when you have food shock prices like that, it's going to have ripple effects all the way through the global food system. Some of the causes that have been outlined in for the reason for the price surge in 2008 were, pretty wide reaching, but it wasn't necessarily the fact that there was less of the crop, for example, which sometimes you can have the price go up because the demand has increased and the supply has decreased. And according to a 2010 study from the Washington-based International Food Policy Research Institute, their research showed that wasn't the main driver for the 2008 surge in prices. It wasn't that demand had increased and supply had decreased. So it wasn't because of crop yields or stocks that were depleted or for rising demand. Oops, there's a mistake in my spelling there. And that should be meat, not mean, for meat and feed grains, but rather they found that it was more to do with the growing demand for biofuels. So as we try to address some of our other sustainable development goals, such as green energy, and we're investing some of the technologies into biofuels, for example, biofuels are pretty heavily users of soy and corn. So some of the reasons for the price surge in 2008 came from this growing demand for biofuels. Also, it was coupled with, at the time, there was high energy prices. So it made biofuels profitable, and crops that would have then gone to feed either other animals to be raised for food, that became really sought after in the biofuels industry. Also, what didn't help was the falling value of the US dollar during this time, and there were export bans and panic buying that was related to rice. So there was a lot of hoarding of rice during this time as well, which drove the price up for rice at that time as well. And then coupled with that, there was bad weather, particularly in Ukraine and Australia, which are the main producers of wheat globally, that really reduced wheat production. So there was a change in the supply there. So crop yields were somewhat of an impact, but really it was these other four things that were driving that 2008 price surge. There have also been similar price shocks that have occurred throughout the MENA region, and one example was in 2011. There were riots because of the price of food, and in particular it was the price of milk and sugar and flour. This is a quote from the New York Times during that period when there were riots in the streets in Algeria Riots over rising food prices and chronic underemployment spiraled out from Algeria's capital on Thursday, with youths torching government buildings and shouting, "Bring us sugar." So they were protesting the price of sugar, or the fact that there was a shortage of sugar coming into Algeria. And if you have time, you don't have to watch the entire video that I've posted here, because it is about 24 minutes, but it gives you an idea of the scale at which people were protesting. If you take a look at the video, you can kind of get a view of what was going on. It's a news report. So take a look at that if you have time. You don't have to watch the whole thing, but the first 10 minutes or so is really kind of enough. It gives you an idea of the scale of what's really going on. So food insecurity prevalence in the MENA region. If the reading for this week really did a nice job of analysing some of the drivers and some of the reasons for why we have food insecurity within the MENA region. And they divided up the countries within the MENA region and found that there were some correlations among countries that were rich and politically stable. They had relatively high GDP per capita. That was cluster 1. And those countries included Lebanon, the UAE, and the Gulf states and Saudi. So they were classified as having the lowest rate of food insecurity, which ended up being about 8% of the population that had severe food insecurity. So the nations that were richer and had a higher political stability, they had the lowest rate of food insecurity. Cluster 2 were the countries that had a middle to low income, but also had low stability, which, low political stability, and also a lower GDP per capita. So, and those countries were Libya, Morocco, Jordan, Iran, Egypt, and Tunisia. And according to the study, they found that cluster of countries that met those criteria, they had sort of a medium rate of food insecurity of about 8 to 16% of the population were food insecure. And then on the other side, they had another cluster of countries that were middle to low income. They had very high political instability and low GDP per capita. So those countries were Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Somalia. And all of those were most affected by food insecurity for obvious reasons. I mean, in these countries, there's conflict, there's corruption, there's political instability. So not surprising that you start to see the population have more than 16% of your population food insecure. And so the reading for this week was really interesting. It gave a lot of insight into the reasons for some of the food insecurity in the MENA region, which, by the way, are not that far dissimilar from the reasons that we have food insecurity in our country, except for political instability. We have pretty stable government, and the reasons why we have food insecurity in the US are not that different for the reasons we have food insecurity in the MENA region. A lot of it comes down to income, education, reciprocity with your neighbors, the social equity that you have within your community. Those things really add to allowing you to remove yourself from food insecurity. So there are highlighted ways in which we can, start to relieve food insecurity. Probably most importantly, I would say at the first, well, they're all really important and they're really interrelated, but changing the way in which we farm and produce our food on a worldwide basis will have huge implications for reducing world hunger. Agricultural systems worldwide, they must be more productive because of the fact that we're going to be having more people on the planet, but at the same time, there's a lot of room for our agricultural system to be less wasteful. For instance, globally, we waste about 40% of crops that are grown around the world, and that is outrageous. And we're not talking about food that is, you know, the scraps that could be fed to the pigs. We're talking about food at the point of manufacturing, at the point of production from the farm. So there are times when whole fields, for example, acres and acres have been planted of, let's say, bok choy, because the supermarket industry says we want as much bok choy as possible because it seems like that's on the rise. The farmer has his bok choy ready, and then there's no buyer because they pull out, and that food just sits in the farm, on the farmland, and rots. It just is wasted, and that happens time and time again. Not only is that directly from the farm that's being wasted, but in transportation, a lot of food that's being transported around the world or transported within country, within their own country, they don't have the technology to refrigerate. So a lot of the food is just becoming perishable and wasted in that way. So 40% is a huge amount of food that we are wasting. And I would argue strongly that if we could fix that problem, we would be able to fix world hunger, among other things. It wouldn't just be that. But in addition to that, we have to have more sustainable agricultural practices and food systems that are resilient and able to operate on a local scale, and be able to operate under severe conditions. So just take this scenario that we have right now, the COVID-19, that could be a whole other lecture on how COVID-19 is impacting the food system. And we will be seeing the ripple effects of this for probably years to come. That would be my estimate. So we need to have more sustainable agricultural practices, including both production and consumption. We need to be more mindful of the way that we're consuming agricultural products and the way that we're using and utilizing those products as well. And it must be pursued from a holistic and integrative perspective. So it's no good to just change one thing. We have to make holistic changes to our food system in order for it to be resilient and sustainable. Obviously, land and healthy soils and water and plant genetic resources are going to be the keys to improving our food production. And until we have more food systems that are cooperating on a global scale, only then will we start to see world hunger really alleviate, if we can manage to get all of these things working in synergy with one another. So within the MENA region, there are several different causes for food insecurity. Obviously, low agricultural production. Countries that are heavily dependent on food imports that will have a much larger proportion of their population food insecure. There's a lack of traditional knowledge that's being passed down. So, the youth in MENA countries, they're not interested in going into agriculture, right? That isn't something that they want to do. They saw their parents try that, and then, they're not interested. So there's a brain drain in agriculture. We're losing some of the smartest minds, and we're losing some of the best innovators within the agricultural system, and they're leaving to do other jobs, right? So it's leaving countries to be more dependent on importing their food than producing their food. Social inequities also can be a cause for food insecurity. And we've already talked about economic instability and conflict and some of the reasons why that can be, have an influence on food insecurity. The unstable political system, that can be one of the biggest drivers, because you'll have one political system set up with some social programs, for example, and then a new government comes in and wipes those social programs away, replaces it with something else before the country can even really give it a go. And people they can't get used to something if the political system is always changing on them. Corruption, of course, is another huge one. There's lots of corruption in the agricultural industry. And so until we can eliminate corruption within these countries, we won't see major changes. Climate change, of course, is also a big player in this. And interestingly enough, the depending on where you are in the world will depend on how much climate change is going to impact your agricultural system, right? So the MENA region is scheduled, or not scheduled, but projected to have more flooding events occur, which could be more devastating to agriculture. In addition, on the flip side, they're also projected to have more droughts on a regular basis. So, of course, in agriculture, that doesn't bode well for food security. Immigration can also have a role to play in food insecurity. So Lebanon, for example, in 2014 saw a huge influx of Syrian refugees that fled. They had 1 million Syrians that fled to Lebanon in 2014, and those people then became very food insecure because it was such a burden on the Lebanon food system that they weren't able to feed those people. So that would be classified more as a transitory food insecurity, but nonetheless, immigration should be considered as one of the causes for food insecurity. And of course, as we have more climate refugees, we're going to be seeing more influx of immigration into countries, which, unless their food system is preparing themselves for that, we will start to see an increase in food security worldwide. So building resilience within the local community and within the local food system is probably the most important thing to do in terms of local food security. It will be critical to eliminate large-scale future shortages and to ensure food security and good nutrition for all. Unless we have a resilient food system that is local, we will start to see many of the food shocks that we've seen in the past repeat themselves, especially in the current situation that we're faced with climate change, emergent diseases. All of these things put a strain on the food system. And unless we have a very resilient local food system and stop becoming dependent on imported foods, we will start to see food insecurity become even more of an issue. Interestingly, all that we've been talking about has been food insecurity, but paradoxically, there's a rise of obesity as well. In the Middle East and North Africa, 60% of adult men, 65% of adult women are overweight or obese. And obese is over 30, and a BMI of 30, right? Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Kuwait saw the biggest increases in obesity between the period of 1980 to 2013, and this was in the Lancet Medical Journal. So it's a strange paradox to have a large portion of your population food insecure, and then another part of your population overweight or obese. And in some cases, the people who are in the overweight and obese category also fall into the food insecure category. It's become such a problem that they're holding conferences. For example, I found this announcement for the International Conference on Obesity and Diet Imbalance in Dubai. So countries like the Emirates that are rich, politically stable, lots of development, lots of Western influence, they're starting to see their population revert to an American diet of cheeseburgers and chicken nuggets. And that's having an influence on the population in terms of their diet choices and obesity. I shared this link with you because it's just startling to see how the Western way of fast food, for example, to see the spread of the fast food industry within the MENA region. So countries like in North Africa and in the Middle East, in Algeria, for example, Morocco, Turkey, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, places that are facing food insecurity. they have a huge number of American fast food chains. This video clip is showing you the locations of the McDonald's, which have spread around the world. So it's a quick video. Go ahead and click on the link and just watch where in the world these McDonald's is only one example. There's also KFC, and there's Taco Bell and Burger King that are popping up all around the world, and they're popping up in places that are food insecure. So part of the reason I'm explaining this to you is one of the reasons we're seeing a rise in obesity, because oftentimes obesity or being overweight is also coupled with food insecurity. So when we were talking earlier about what are you going to choose, are you going to choose quality or quantity? You're going to choose quantity, right, over quality if the price difference is enough to persuade you to go to McDonald's for 5 dirhams rather than buy, some other, you buy 5 dirhams worth of radishes, for example, and it'll feed one person. You buy 5 dirhams worth of a cheeseburger and it's going to feed your kids. So it's exactly the same thing we're seeing happening here in America. People who are food insecure in America are making choices and buying food that isn't good for them and leads them down a path of obesity, but they are also food insecure. So take a look at the video. It shows you how many McDonald's locations there are around the world, and it shows you by the country as it moves around the globe, and I was staggered by it. So it's worth thinking about. It really gives you food for thought to see how local traditional cultures are being affected, right? And that plays into the whole idea of food insecurity and healthy, nutritious diets. If we're no longer providing our people with nutrition that's affordable and offering them fast food that is awful, then obviously they're going to choose fast food. So yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. Okay, so what I would like you to do, this video was about 30 minutes. I'd like to have you spend the rest of the hour and 15 minutes or hour and 10 minutes that we would have had remaining in class. So it's going to take about half an hour or so, 45 minutes. I'd like you guys to research examples of programs that exist in the MENA region that have been specifically designed to reduce food insecurity. And then on the discussion board, add a new thread that you have, for the example that you've found. I'll give you an example. The Green Morocco program is one example of a social program that was instituted, and that was been really praised as one of the ways that Morocco has reduced food insecurity in their region. So whoever's first to get researching Green Morocco, you're already on the way to winning. But what I'd like you to do is not just focus on that one social program, find new ones, and let's see how many social programs we can find that have been successful. I'd like to start the discussion thinking about ways in which ways that the MENA region is really trying to alleviate food insecurity, and see if there's some parallels here within the US. But so yeah, that's going to be your little assignment for the time remaining, which should take you about half an hour, 45 minutes or so. All right, so I'm going to sign off here, and I will look to see how you guys are getting on. If you go to the discussion board, there'll be more information on the kinds of posts I'm looking for, with a word limit. 500 words is probably enough. So, spend some time trying to find a program and then report back on that. All right. I will see you next time.